At first glance, you might dismiss it as nothing more than a small, desolate, flat, rocky outcrop of land near the coast, a mere island standing guard at the entrance of a tranquil bay. Yet its destiny was far from ordinary. Instead, it became a place defined by suffering, isolation, despair, humiliation, and abuse. For nearly 5 centuries, this tiny island served as a tool for authorities to separate, confine, and detain those who dared challenge their rule. In the mid-20th century, Robben Island emerged as a stark symbol of an odious regime, one that believed society must be rigidly segregated based on ethnic and genetic criteria. The regime sent those who opposed its ideology to the island, expecting them to wither and capitulate. Instead, the prisoners found strength in each other, sowing the seeds for a new, united society. Welcome to Robben Island, South Africa, and its maximum security prison, the unlikely place where 3 future presidents once defied the system using education, calligraphy, and football. Robben Island is a low-lying, rocky piece of land situated at the entrance of Table Bay, about 10 kilometres off the coast of Cape Town, South Africa. It stretches approximately 3.6 kilometres from north to south and 2 kilometres from east to west, covering a total area of roughly 5.2 square kilometres. Around 12,000 years ago, the island was part of the mainland, connected by a saddle to the Blouberg, or Blue Mountain, to the east. This location made Robben Island the natural choice for a role it would serve for 469 years. A place of confinement and isolation. Here, political prisoners, ordinary convicts, and even patients with contagious diseases or mental illnesses were separated from society. Robben Island's earliest inhabitants may have been the local Khoi people, often simply called the Khoi, or perhaps they only visited the island sporadically. Unfortunately, there are no records or archaeological findings confirming the existence of permanent settlements in the area. However, beginning in the 17th century, several Khois did settle on the island, albeit against their will. The history of this small piece of land underwent a dramatic change in 1488 when Portuguese explorers Bartolomeu Dias and Jan del Infante became the first Europeans to discover it. They made a brief stop on the islands to hunt for seals and penguins. From that point onward, the islands grew increasingly popular with Portuguese sailors. Initially, it served as a convenient resupply station. Then, starting in 1525, it began to function as an informal penal colony, marking the beginning of its more notorious era. By the mid-17th century, South Africa had become a Dutch colony. In 1652, new administrators took control of the islands and renamed it after its abundant population of seals, Robben in Dutch. Yet what they prized most about their new asset wasn't the charming sea mammals, but rather its significant economic potential. Part of the island's terrain was ideal for sheep farming, and its quarries provided an abundance of building material. Continuing the tradition established by the Portuguese, the Dutch forcibly relocated people to Robben Island who had little desire to be there. Initially, these were the Khois, captured, enslaved, and forced to work in the quarries. Very soon, the colonists repurposed the area as a prison for those who opposed their rule, including the Khoi leader, Alchamato. Interned in 1658, Alchamato is considered Robben Island's first political prisoner. Remarkably, he was one of the few who managed to escape from the penal colony, fleeing it in late 1659. From 1671 onwards, common criminals were added to the roster of convicts enduring a miserable life alongside penguins and seals. Life proved equally harsh for colonial officials, as attested by a 1674 poem written by Commissar Pieter Denane, who had been dispatched to Robben to quell a prisoner's revolt. Denane described the island as being, quote, manned by a population of stupid roguery where no provision for the throat or the tooth or against the sharp cold is made. In contrast, the commissioner introduced himself as someone, quote, who likes to be a regular customer or where sadness is totally banned and glasses filled right to the rim. He eagerly hoped to, quoting again, shove this island to one side and to, quoting again, have nothing to do with its arid sand. Okay, Peter, you made your point. The place sucked. And it likely sucked even more if you were one of the troublemakers arrested by Dutch colonial authorities throughout their vast empire and then sent to rot on Robben Island during the 17th and 18th centuries. Starting in 1722, the prison attracted a new private client, the Dutch East India Company. Despite a common misconception, this company was not the most valuable private enterprise in history. It was immensely wealthy and wielded power on par with many governments of the time. Consequently, the company made powerful enemies among the political and religious elites in the territories it colonized, many of whom would eventually spend their final days on Robben Island. One notable prisoner was Syed Abdurrahman Motaru, Prince of Madurai in India, who died on the island in 1754 after 14 years in captivity. His passing was commemorated in 1969 with the inauguration of the Muturu Kramat Shrine, now a Muslim pilgrimage site. In 1795, when the British took over the Cape Colony and Robben Island, little changed in substance. The new administrators continued to use the island to detain local leaders who opposed further colonial expansion. In 1799, the Khoi and the Xhosa peoples are united to attack British colonial forces and farmers of Dutch descent. One of the rebellion's most prominent leaders was a Khoi clan head named David Sturman, renowned for his expeditions to recapture cattle taken by the Boer farmers. When Sturman publicly opposed the conscription of the Khoi into British-led militias, the authorities decided that they had had enough of him. In 1809, they imprisoned him on Robben Island. However, the prison's security was evidently pretty lax. In December of that same year, Sturman managed to escape his cell, stole a whaling boat, and fled to the mainland. After a decade of anti-colonial resistance, he was arrested once more and sentenced to hard labour on Robben Island. Yet on August 9, 1820, the indomitable leader commandeered another boat and once again attained his freedom. This time, however, British forces were more effective. They located Sturman in December 1820 and immediately sent him back to the island. Determined to eliminate any chance of another escape, the prison warders chained the determined Khoi leader to a wall before transferring to Australia in February 1823. In 1845, Robben Island underwent a major transformation when Colonial Secretary John Montagu decided it was best to relocate the penal colony to the mainland for public work, where prisoners could serve as labour. Despite this shift, the islands continued to be a place of confinement and misery. Its facilities were repurposed to accommodate those deemed undesirable by Montagu and his administration: homeless individuals, alcoholics, and patients afflicted by mental illness, leprosy, and sexually transmitted diseases. Life on Robben Island remains harsh for these new residents, just as it had been for the prison population. Patients, particularly those in poor health, had to endure a meagre diet, substandard medical care, and forced isolation from their families and friends. As early as the 1860s, some patients began writing letters of complaint to colonial authorities and the local press, their grievances supported by progressive clergy members and medical professionals. One such letter, addressed to a judge in 1895, reads, quote here, "The 1st of December 1894 was a happy day because God had given England the power 64 years earlier to free slaves, and over 1,000 people were released so that men, women and children could gather to worship and thank the Lord. My honour, what have we done that we cannot enjoy this right? We are guarded day and night by constables like slaves, and we are now growing impatient with this godless and sinful law." It took some time, but eventually the campaign of complaints led to the closure of the hospital on Robben Island in 1931. By that time, the Union of South Africa, then a self-governing dominion within the British Empire, had assigned Robben Island to its armed forces so it could be turned into a fortress guarding Table Bay. For about a decade, the island served purely as a military base, fully equipped with gun batteries, tunnels, bunkers, and an airstrip. For the first time in centuries, Robben Island was not used to confine someone against their will. That didn't last very long, though. It seems Robben Island's fate was always to confine and detain. 2 years into World War II, part of the military base was repurposed as a POW camp. At the end of the war, the military facilities were once again transformed, this time into a detention centre reserved for ordinary criminals serving long sentences. However, Robben Island's most infamous chapter would not emerge until a decade later. In 1948, the South African government formally instituted apartheid, an Afrikaans term that could be translated as apartness, though it essentially signified institutionalized racial segregation. This policy severely curtailed the human rights of the Khoi, the Xhosa, and other non-white citizens, relegating them to second-class status. Naturally, political and armed resistance movements sprang up to combat apartheid and to draw international attention to this odious injustice. In 1959, as the state cracked down on these movements, the Minister for Justice announced that Robben Island would be transformed into a maximum security prison designed to isolate both ordinary convicts and political prisoners, namely anti-apartheid activists, from society. Apartheid finally ended in 1994. Now, before that year, nearly 3,000 political prisoners were confined on Robben Island. Activist Ahmed Kathrada explained that the authorities' objective was to isolate the movement's leaders, effectively rendering them invisible to society, spreading a sense of hopelessness, and ultimately, quote, to crush the spirit of the people by crushing the struggle itself. Moreover, the very confines of Robben Island, with its harsh shores and imposing walls, sought to suppress the spirit of numerous resistance leaders. This effort targeted figures from several movements, including the National Liberation Front, the African National Congress, and its armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, also known as MK. One of the notable inmates was lecturer Dr. Neville Alexander, founder of the militant Yu Chi Chang Club. Alexander was charged with conspiracy to commit sabotage and imprisoned from 1964 to 1974. After his release, the lecturer authored an extensive dossier about the prison, offering vivid insights into the living conditions on the island. Robben Island is perhaps even more infamous for having detained not one, not two, but 3 future presidents of post-apartheid South Africa: Nelson Mandela, Kagame Motlanthe, and Jacob Zuma. Motlanthe and Zuma were convicted on charges of sabotage and conspiring to overthrow the government. Both served 10 years on Robben Island, albeit at different times. Zuma's sentence began in 1963, while Motlanthe's started in 1977. Among the 3, Nelson Mandela was the longest-serving and arguably the most famous unwilling guest of Robben Island. Shortly after becoming the leader of the MK in 1962, Mandela was arrested and given a 5-year sentence on charges of leaving the country illegally and inciting a strike. He first set foot on Robben Island in May 1963, but after just 1 month, he was transferred to a prison in Pretoria. Then in October, Mandela and 9 other leading activists appeared in the Rivonia trial, aptly referred to as, quote, the trial that changed South Africa. During the proceedings, Mandela delivered a rousing speech in which he condemned the court as illegitimate and argued that defying unjust segregationist laws was always justified. His defense, however, was ultimately unsuccessful, and the MK leader, along with 7 other defendants, was sentenced to life imprisonment in June 1964. This marked the moment when Nelson Mandela returned to Robben Island. He remained there until March 1982, when he was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town. During those 18 years, Mandela and his compatriots were subjected to alienating and humiliating routines designed to strip them of their dignity and to isolate them from their relatives, friends, and supporters. Yet their spirits proved to be stronger. Robben's reputation as an island prison meant that inmates rarely had contact with the outside world. Although the island's relatively close to the mainland, visitor access was stringently regulated by prison authorities. In any event, the travel expenses to Cape Town and the subsequent ferry ride to the island were prohibitively high for most prisoners' families. For example, during his 10 years of incarceration, Jacob Zuma never received a visit, not even from his mother, who worked as a domestic helper on a meager salary. Instead, Zuma asked her in writing to save the fare money rather than make the journey to Robben Island. In addition to controlling physical visits, every letter sent or received by the prisoners was subject to strict oversight by Robben's censors. Letters written in local languages such as Zulu, Xhosa, or Sotho were completely forbidden, at least until the 1970s. Although inmates were allowed to write in English or Afrikaans, the censors would often redact or entirely remove any sentence they considered undesirable. And the term undesirable referred to any mention of politics, history, or culture. In short, any subject that veered away from the routine messages concerning the health of family and friends. Often, the original message was reduced solely to its salutation and greetings. According to Dr. Alexander, this form of censorship was designed to curtail political discussion and prevent activist inmates from sharing their ideas. Yet it also stemmed from the censors' own ignorance as they struggled to differentiate cultural references from anti-government discourse. As Dr. Alexander put it, quote, anything approaching politics is taboo, and anything in which the censors are not interested is best left unsaid. Thus, cultural starvation of the political prisoner is built into the system simply because of the lack of an intellectual culture of the warders. End quote. In the mid-1970s, detained activists Walter Sisulu and Ahmed Kathrada persuaded Nelson Mandela to clandestinely work on a particularly forbidden piece of writing, his autobiography. The leader of the MK composed it chapter by chapter in secret, later sharing his work with Sisulu and Kathrada for their corrections and comments. The two then passed the chapters to their companions, Lalu Chiba and the future Minister of Transport, Mak Maharaj, who was skilled transcribing the drafts into minuscule handwriting. In doing so, they were able to condense what originally filled 10 pages into a single page. Each chapter was subsequently concealed inside cocoa containers and buried in a yard using digging tools secretly crafted by another prisoner, Jeff Masemola. Mandela's work was completed in 1976, just in time for Mac Maharaj's release from prison, allowing the activist to smuggle the 60 pages of tiny handwriting onto the mainland. This manuscript would later form the basis for Nelson Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, which was published in 1994. However, the achievement of the Robben Island editorial team proved to be bittersweet. Shortly after Maharaj's release, a construction project unearthed some of those cocoa containers which still held early drafts and notes written in the handwriting of Mandela, Sisulu, and Kasrada. As punishment, prison authorities withdrew study privileges for 4 years. Losing these privileges was a soul-destroying blow to the prisoners. Some might argue that the 3 scribes dodged a bullet, considering that punishment on Robben Island could be very, very harsh. Dr. Alexander's dossier reveals how the prison regime could reach what he described as peaks of inhumanity and brutality, characterized by extreme harshness and physical pressure on prisoners. This severity was particularly evident during 3 periods, from 1962 to 1963, from August 1966 to early 1967, and again from 1971 to 1972. Between these episodes of extreme cruelty, prisoners sometimes experienced periods of relative leniency and reform. Moreover, from April 1973 onwards, warders appeared to refrain from overt violence. Now, that's not to say that Robben Island had transformed into a Club Med. On the contrary, inmates' activities remained strictly monitored and regulated by prison authorities, especially their contact with the outside world, and their days were still defined by the harsh routines of backbreaking labor. Some of the ordinary prisoners were allowed to train in skilled trades such as plumbing, tailoring, or shoemaking. However, this opportunity was never extended to the political prisoners who were coerced into performing spine-breaking, muscle-tearing, soul-destroying menial work, specifically carving stones and lime in the local quarries. Early on, political prisoners working in the quarries sought ways to make the labor less monotonous. For example, they self-motivated by singing communal songs while working in time with the beat. By the late 1960s, however, prison authorities forbade the practice, claiming that the prisoners were singing freedom songs. At times, inmates were ordered to chop wood around the island, repair roads, collect seaweed, or perform routine maintenance and cleaning tasks around the facility. Yet perhaps the most pointless activity imposed on the prisoners was the so-called napping. This was far from the pleasant kind of napping, the kind where you lie down in the sun and enjoy a well-deserved snooze. This was known as napping, spelt with a K, and it involved crushing stones in the prison yard. Every prisoner was required to be in the yard from 7:30 a.m. until 4 p.m., striking large stones with heavy hammers until they were reduced to fine gravel. Inmates were expected to remain silent as they worked, tirelessly smashing the rocks without any cover or shelter from the elements. Dr. Alexander notes in his dossier that napping was at the center of a serious incident during the winter of 1968, and keep in mind that we're referring to the winter months in South Africa, which corresponds to the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Since the winters on Robben Island could be extremely harsh, prisoners involved in napping had repeatedly requested that the authorities provide some form of shelter, even something as simple as cardboard panels to protect them while crushing rocks in the yard. These requests were consistently denied until, on one particularly cold and windy day, the inmates refused to work until they had spoken with Captain Kellerman, the warder's commanding officer. Kellerman did show up, but he arrived with 2 truckloads of guards armed with rubber truncheons and rifles. When the protesters still refused to work, the warders marched them back to their cells. 50 protesters were locked up for 1 month, while 4 inmates, labeled as the ringleaders, spent 6 months in isolation. Additionally, all the protesters lost a hard-earned privilege they valued above all, the right to study. Now, as we'll learn later, the opportunity to study was one of the main reasons the political prisoners at Robben Island endured years of incarceration. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Robben's prisoner population hovered around 600, supported by an additional 200 to 300 guards and administrative staff. According to South Africa's Prison Act, such a population required a resident doctor. However, during this period, authorities only allowed a visiting doctor from the mainland 1 or 2 mornings a week. Long queues of inmates would form as they hoped to see the doctors, causing severe overcrowding in the small prison hospital. Dr. Alexander observed with grim humor that this congestion was efficiently resolved through a straightforward display of physical violence. Quote, Warder Mostert was the main perpetrator of this scandalous behavior. He would storm into the hospital queue among the prisoners and with his massive fists begin punching left, right and center until only the most courageous remained standing. In this manner, the problem of numbers was effectively solved. End quote. As you might expect, the constant threat of physical violence and abuse loomed over the prisoners' lives.
Kgalema Motlanthe recalled that violence among inmates was common, especially as ordinary criminals often bullied political prisoners. The future president once challenged one such bully to a good old-fashioned fistfight. True to form, when confronted, the man panicked and walked away. Now, the first president of post-apartheid South Africa, Nelson Mandela, notably reported that he never suffered physical violence or mistreatment at the hands of his fellow inmates or the prison guards. In fact, in his writings, he made a point of highlighting the humane side of his jailers, describing only a minority of them as rogues. As mentioned earlier, the prison authorities alternated periods of relative leniency with stretches of draconian punishment, during which guards would stage brutal mass assaults. In March 1964, political inmates working at the quarries were accused of working too slowly and were subsequently rounded up and taken back to the prison. As they were herded back into their cell blocks, they were met by squads of young warders, all armed with batons and pick handles. To quote Dr. Alexander again, the young white warders were given the opportunity to vent their frustration fully. News of violent reprisals had already reached beyond the prison walls, but authorities blamed these actions on common criminals, members of the Big Five gangs. In June 1964, to demonstrate that the guards were prepared to punish the Big Five, the prisoner's commanding officer, Colonel Wessels, organized a vicious carry-on. Common criminals were stripped naked and forced to walk between two lines of warders swinging batons. Later that night, the battered inmates were assaulted once again before being handed 2 ounces of tobacco each by Colonel Wessels and told to forget the incident. In May 1971, political prisoners launched a hunger strike to protest the mistreatment of 4 Namibian inmates whose meals had been withheld by head warder Carstens. In response, his superior, Chief Warder Fourie, led a squad of guards on a nighttime raid. The warders burst into each cell, allegedly searching for unauthorized objects. During the raid, 28 prisoners were beaten by the guards, and some suffered severe injuries. Japtha Masemola was beaten into unconsciousness, while Abel Chilane suffered injuries so severe that he urinated blood for several days. Attempts to have the assaults reported to lawyers were thwarted, and doctors were simply unavailable for 3 whole weeks. By that time, the visible injuries had healed. Beyond these episodes of mass violence, political prisoners were never spared from daily mistreatment. Most guards resorted to shouting or verbally abusing the convicts. Unsurprisingly, these warders supported apartheid and regarded Robben Island's inmates as racially inferior. Prejudice was evident at every level, though it appeared more virulent among the lower ranks. These guards demanded that prisoners address them as master and threatened violent retaliation if the demand was not met. Nonetheless, some notable political prisoners acknowledged that not all of the island's guards and officials were entirely hostile to dialogue. In many instances, they would engage in patient, tactful, often hurtful discussions. Such discussions were described by Dr. Alexander as, quoting again, "one of the great human events on the island. For here, many of the black prisoners and white warders for the first time are able to exchange ideas about the way of life in South Africa." Robben Island had been conceived as a place to isolate and repress the activists opposing apartheid. In that respect, it performed its role effectively, at least on a purely physical level. Yet the prison failed to fully extinguish the minds, the courage, and the spirit of those who were detained. One avenue through which prisoners found self-expression was sport, a pastime that was fully permitted and even encouraged after 1967, during the island's relatively less draconian phases. Within the communal cells and recreation halls, political prisoners engaged in spirited games of table tennis and pool. The Robben community soon elevated these activities by organizing tournaments and even awarding certificates to winners, meticulously hand-drawn on sheets of A4 paper, a rare commodity under the circumstances. Outdoors in the exercise yard, inmates played cricket, rugby, and soccer. The latter was particularly popular, and the prisoners formed several teams, such as the Rangers, captained by future President Jacob Zuma. These teams competed in a prison league strictly regulated by a binding constitution that was actually recognized by FIFA. In addition to nurturing their bodies, detainees dedicated themselves to expanding their minds. Paradoxically, the penal colony served as a center of aggregation, where activists from different, often competing organizations could share their ideals and engage in lively, yet respectful political debate. Our much-quoted friend today, Dr. Alexander, described his 10 years in Robben's purgatory as an overall ennobling and enriching experience, during which he observed most prisoners becoming, quote, much better people. At the heart of Robben's enriching experience were the informal education programs run by convicts themselves since the early 60s. Prisoners took advantage of any break during their hours of backbreaking labor to teach each other about their speciality topics. For example, Nelson Mandela taught law, Neville Alexander lectured in history, and the future Minister of Transport, Mac Maharaj, taught economics. These improvised classes extended even to ordinary criminals and convicts who had very little formal education, so little in fact that many could neither read nor write. Yet they still joined the informal faculty, sharing valuable practical skills. Little by little, and largely unnoticed by the authorities, the inmates created what Alexander nicknamed the University of Robben Island. In his view, this institution, quote, was one of the best universities in the country. It also showed me that you don't need professors. From 1966 onwards, prisoners were allowed to enroll in formal correspondence courses, although these study rights could be revoked as punishment or just withdrawn entirely. The University of Robben Island, on the other hand, never ceased to provide education, from the very basics to the most advanced subjects. Some inmates learned to read and write, while others earned makeshift diplomas in history, economics, and law, and one diploma was even signed by Nelson Mandela himself. The most active course of study was managed by the political committee, once chaired by the future President Zuma. The committee was responsible for organizing political study groups and overseeing the political education of prisoners, especially those who had recently been interned. Thanks to the efforts of the university and the political committee, the detained activists successfully challenged both the prison system and the broader apartheid regime. They joined forces, refined their ideas, and disseminated them among young activists and non-political prisoners. As Motlanthe would later recall, quote, "The years out there were the most productive years in one's life. To me, those years gave meaning to life." In the late 1980s, the South African government faced mounting pressure both internally and internationally. In August 1989, newly elected state president Friedrich Wilhelm de Klerk initiated the process of dismantling apartheid. In October, he ordered the unconditional release of 7 political prisoners, and by February 1990, he had authorized the unbanning of several protest movements. On the 11th of that month, Nelson Mandela, who was then detained at Pollsmoor Prison, finally experienced freedom. At Robben Island, cell doors were thrown open as well, releasing approximately 50 political prisoners. The remaining inmates demanded the immediate release of all activists, and on March 3rd, 343 detainees staged a large hunger strike. While President de Klerk supported the idea, he faced opposition from the white electorate, as many of the prisoners at Robben had been involved in politically motivated acts of violence. After all, the African National Congress maintained an armed wing, the MK, which had executed violent actions against both South African security forces and civilians. According to the October 1998 report published by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, quote, "In the course of the armed struggle, a number of military actions took place which resulted in the death or injury of civilians, and where gross violations of human rights can be said to have been committed despite ANC policy to avoid unnecessary loss of life." End quote. From 1976 to 1986, MK attacks resulted in the deaths of 30 security personnel and 100 civilians, including 60 black individuals. The report also details 10 bombings carried out between May 1983 and July 1988. The bloodiest incident occurred on May 20th, 1983, when the MK Special Operations Unit targeted the South African Air Force administrative officers, resulting in the deaths of 11 Air Force employees, 8 civilians, and 2 MK operatives. During the same period, MK conducted a campaign in rural Transvaal that specifically targeted military patrols using landmines. As the report notes, quote, "A number of civilians, both white farmers, their families, and black farm laborers were killed when these explosives detonated." Nevertheless, the government continued its release policy, gradually freeing political prisoners based on the severity of their offences. Bit by bit, most activists were released from their confinement and returned to life on the mainland. The last to leave Robben Island in May 1991 were those who had been awaiting the death sentence. Robben Island remained active for several years, still hosting a number of common criminals. The last prisoner was transferred in 1996, marking the end of Robben Island's long history as a place of confinement, and with that, it was time to open a new chapter. In May 1994, when Nelson Mandela became president, his African National Congress Party nominated Ahmed Kathrada as chair of the Future of Robben Island Committee. His task was to decide what would become of the island. In September 1996, Kathrada presented his recommendation to the cabinet. The prison on Robben Island was to become a museum. Quoting him, "We will not want Robben Island to be a monument to our hardship and suffering. We would want it to be a monument reflecting the triumph of the human spirit against the forces of evil, a triumph of freedom and human dignity over repression and humiliation, a triumph of the new South Africa over the old." The plan aligned perfectly with the government's program of renewal and reconciliation. So the museum was inaugurated by President Mandela in January 1997. 2 years later, UNESCO declared Robben Island a World Heritage Site based on two main criteria. The buildings of Robben Island bear eloquent witness to its somber history, and Robben Island and its prison buildings symbolize the triumph of the human spirit of freedom and of democracy over oppression. Today, the Robben Island Museum remains active, playing a vital role in preserving both the island's history and the personal stories of its former prisoners. In fact, ex-detainees now serve as tour guides, sharing their experiences directly with visitors. Former prisoners Mos Ngosheng and Luvulu Ndzusu welcome museum visitors by introducing the idea of Robben Island as the midwife of democratic South Africa. For its role in shaping the anti-apartheid movement, one notable visitor was the late Dirk Carstens, a legend of South African marketing and advertising. In a March 2019 article, he expanded on the idea by pointing out the miraculous stupidity of the decision to place all the so-called enemies of the state in one place. Rather than breaking them down as intended, this decision had the opposite effect. It only made them stronger. This outcome was achieved in no small measure thanks to the ingenuity, resourcefulness, willpower, and generosity of those very enemies of the state. Confined to a place of misery, a barren environment designed to produce barren minds, they refused to succumb to desperation. Instead, they transformed Robben Island's very nature from a prison island into an island where hope was born. Thank you for watching.